I don't care that you just gave birth. Call a taxi, Julian shouted. The line went dead. No apology. No hesitation. Just cold, clear rejection. Ever been abandoned right when you needed someone most? Hit subscribe. This story is for you. I stood outside Pacific Mercy Hospital, holding my son in a blanket that still smelled of antiseptic. I was bleeding, dizzy, half unzipped in a hospital robe, and completely alone. Julian hadn't come. He knew I was being discharged today. We planned it together. A car seat, a picture, maybe even a quiet afternoon at home. But he wasn't at the curb. He was at our apartment, getting things ready for Camilla Royce, his ex. Daphne didn't know whether to cry or scream. Her legs trembled from surgery, her arms ached, but she bent down, cradled her baby tighter, and ordered an Uber through chattering teeth. Camilla, the woman who once said Daphne was too soft to keep a man like Julian. Apparently, she was right. The baby whimpered softly. Daphne leaned against the metal railing for support. Cars passed. People glanced. No one stopped. In that moment, she realized this wasn't just postpartum exhaustion. This was betrayal, weaponized. The Uber arrived within 6 minutes. The driver opened the door without a word. Daphne nodded, slid in slowly, and whispered the address. 1614 Irving Street, apartment 4B, Nina's place. As the city blurred past the car windows, Daphne's mind replayed the voice in her ear. Julian's voice. Unapologetic. Cold. Choosing Camilla over his newborn, over her. And something inside Daphne changed. She was no longer just a new mother. She was something else now. Something Julian had just awakened. Nina didn't ask a single question. She didn't have to. The moment she opened the door and saw Daphne on the threshold, pale and trembling with the baby pressed tight against her chest, she knew something terrible had happened. Daphne's lips were chapped, her hospital bracelet still clung to her wrist, and her eyes were hollow in a way Nina had never seen before. She stepped aside silently, letting them in. The apartment was warm, dimly lit by a lamp in the corner. As Daphne sank into the sofa, she felt everything in her body threaten to collapse. The adrenaline, the grief, the betrayal, churning beneath her skin like a storm held together by thread. Nina returned with hot tea and a fresh blanket, took the baby with careful hands, and wrapped him as if he were her own. Then she came back and held Daphne without asking. Not a word. Just arms. Just silence. Just the kind of presence only a best friend could offer. That was when Daphne finally let go. No sobs, no screams, just slow, silent tears that dripped onto her sweater one by one, as if her body had to bleed sorrow before it could speak. It took an hour before she said anything. He didn't come. He was home. With her. Her voice cracked at the last word. Nina tensed, her entire body reacting like someone had thrown a rock at glass. Camilla? Daphne nodded. She's living there now, in our apartment, in the nursery, and he told me to call a taxi while I held his son. Nina didn't say anything for a long while, then muttered, "That absolute bastard." She placed the baby back in Daphne's arms and sat down beside her. "You're staying here for as long as you need, you hear me?" Daphne nodded slowly. "I don't even know what to feel. I think I'm too broken to feel anything anymore." Nina looked her straight in the eye. "No, you're not broken. You're angry, and you should be." Then she reached for her phone. "And I know exactly who you need to talk to." That night, while the baby finally slept for more than 15 minutes in a row, Nina sat across from Daphne at the kitchen table and typed a name into her contacts. "Miles Thorne. He's a lawyer. He went to college with my cousin. He's quiet but brilliant. If Julian thinks he can humiliate you and get away with it, he has no idea who he's dealing with. Daphne sipped her tea slowly, watching steam rise from the mug like smoke from a battlefield. Somewhere inside her, beneath the tears, the exhaustion, the stitches, something small and sharp was beginning to form. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. But it was resolve. Daphne didn't want to destroy Julian. She just wanted her life back. Her name, her child's safety, and the home she had paid for, decorated and built with hope. If Miles could help her get that back, then maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a very different story. Miles Thorne didn't look like a lawyer. At least not the kind Daphne imagined when Nina first mentioned him. No sleek briefcase, no overpriced suit. He wore a navy sweater, dark jeans, and glasses that slid down his nose whenever he leaned forward. But his voice was steady, his gaze calm, and his questions surgical. He met them at a corner cafe near Mission Street, not far from his small legal office. Nina had arranged the meeting. Daphne arrived 15 minutes early and nearly walked away 3 times before he showed up. But when he greeted her with a firm handshake and said, "Take your time. I know how much it costs to speak," something inside her unclenched. She told him everything, from the cold hospital curb to Julian's voice, telling her to call a taxi, to Camilla in the apartment, and the nursery that no longer existed. She spoke in fragments at first, but as the words spilled out, they formed the outline of what had really happened. Not just heartbreak, not just betrayal, but calculated removal. Miles listened without interrupting, only taking brief notes on a small notepad. When she paused, he looked up and said, "Do you know whose name the apartment is in?" Daphne blinked. "Mine. I bought it before we got married. I paid the down payment, the mortgage, everything. Julian moved in later." Miles nodded. "That's good. Legally, very good. Property acquired before marriage, if not commingled, is yours." Daphne exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath since the moment she stepped out of that hospital. "So, I can get it back?" Miles leaned forward. "You never lost it, but you will need to fight for it. And not just the apartment, the safety of your child, the trauma you were subjected to. If what you're saying is accurate, we're not only looking at a property case. We're talking about a pattern of emotional coercion, parental interference, and unlawful occupancy." Nina raised her brows. "In English, please." Miles smiled slightly. "We can file for legal recognition that Daphne was forcibly removed from her own home under manipulative circumstances, that Julian knowingly created conditions that made her departure feel necessary, then replaced her in the space she owned. We can also seek temporary custody protection, and later, full custody." Daphne's fingers curled around the ceramic coffee mug. It had been warm once. Now, like her, it had gone cold. But there was heat in Miles's voice, not loud, not aggressive, just quiet certainty, like someone who had done this before, someone who wins. He laid out a list, proof of ownership, messages or calls from Julian, witness statements, receipts, anything that could show the timeline of events. Daphne nodded at each item, already thinking of the boxes she'd left behind in that apartment. Boxes labeled with her name, packed by hands that had once promised to protect her. As they got up to leave, Miles turned to her. "One more thing. Julian may not take this well. Men like him rarely do when control slips away. Be ready." Daphne didn't flinch. Not this time. She adjusted the strap of her diaper bag, looked him in the eye and said, "I wasn't ready before. Now I am." The hallway smelled like lemon disinfectant and betrayal. Daphne stood outside the apartment door, her hand hovering just above the knob. Miles had arranged it, one brief, supervised visit to collect the rest of her belongings before the legal motion was filed. Julian agreed, but insisted she come alone. No Nina, no lawyer, just Daphne, 20 minutes, nothing more. She took a breath and turned the key. The lock clicked with a familiar sound that now felt foreign. The door creaked open. Inside, the apartment looked clean. Too clean. The curtains were different. White lace where she'd hung warm linen. Her art had been replaced with abstract canvases in gold and gray. The bookshelf was rearranged. A pink orchid she didn't recognize sat on the coffee table, blooming in defiance. She stepped inside cautiously. The silence buzzed like static. From the corner of her eye, she caught movement in the nursery. Number. The door was ajar. She pushed it open. Camilla Royce was inside. She was barefoot, wearing Daphne's ivory robe, loosely tied at the waist. Her hair was up in a messy bun, the kind that's meant to look effortless but takes effort. In her arms, Daphne's son. He was dressed in a new onesie Daphne hadn't bought, resting quietly in the arms of the woman who had tried to ruin her life 2 years ago. For a second, the world slowed. Every sound disappeared. Daphne's breath caught somewhere between rage and disbelief. Camilla looked up. "Oh," she said casually. "Didn't expect you this early." Daphne stepped forward, voice shaking. "Give me my son." Camilla adjusted the baby slightly, but didn't move. "He was crying. I thought I'd calm him down. Julian's in the shower." "Give me my son." The baby stirred, and Camilla finally handed him over. Her expression didn't change. Cool, calm, composed. Daphne held her son tight, kissed the top of his head, and backed out of the room. Julian appeared in the hallway, towel around his neck, still dripping. "What the hell is this, Daphne? You can't just barge in." "I'm here under agreement. 20 minutes. You gave permission." "Jesus, calm down. Camilla was just helping." "She was wearing my robe," Daphne snapped, "holding my child. In the nursery I painted with my own hands." Julian rolled his eyes. "It's not your nursery anymore. You left, remember?" Daphne laughed. Short, sharp, bitter. "You told me to call a taxi after I gave birth. You let her move in before I'd even healed." He stepped closer. "You're being emotional again." "I'm being a mother," she said, turning away. "And I'm done being silent." She walked to the hallway closet and began collecting what was left. Her shoes, a box labeled Daphne Studio, a tote bag with receipts and journals. Julian didn't speak again. Camilla stood in the doorway of the nursery, arms crossed. On her way out, Daphne paused by the door. She turned, looked at both of them, and said, "You've made this easy. I hope you enjoyed playing house, because now I'm taking it back." Nina didn't say anything for the first few seconds after Daphne walked through her apartment door, clutching her son like he was the last safe thing left in the world. She just looked at her friend's face. Tight, pale, eyes dry but darker than before. Then she reached for the baby, cradled him gently, and let Daphne sit down at the kitchen table. When Daphne finally spoke, her voice was flat, controlled. "She was wearing my robe, in my nursery, holding my child like she belonged there." Nina blinked once, then twice. "You're kidding." Daphne shook her head. She looked me in the eye and said, "Didn't expect you this early? Like I was the guest." Nina let out a breath like a hiss. She stood up, pulled open the kitchen drawer, and grabbed the phone charger. "We're documenting everything from now on. You're not walking into that apartment again without evidence." She paused. "Do you still have the texts from Julian? The ones telling you to call a cab?" "I haven't deleted anything." "Good. That's proof of abandonment. Combined with her holding your baby, without your consent. This isn't just betrayal, it's legal leverage." Later that night, with the baby asleep and Nina scrolling through recorded clips on her phone, Daphne opened her messages and emailed every last one to Miles. The call came the next morning. "I need to see both of you," Miles said, his voice calm but clipped. "Today. Noon." When they arrived at his office, Miles already had a folder open. Inside were printed screenshots, time-stamped photos from Nina's phone, and a draft motion for an emergency protective order. "She held the baby without your consent. That alone raises questions about custody boundaries. But when we combine it with Julian's statement, telling you to call a taxi after giving birth, and the fact that he installed someone else in the home you legally own, we're no longer in gray territory. We're in court territory." Daphne swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" "It means we file now," Miles said. "We request temporary full custody, immediate eviction of both Julian and Camilla from the property, and cite emotional endangerment as grounds for emergency relief." Nina leaned forward. "Do we have enough for that?" Miles nodded. "More than enough. We've got intent, coercion, documentation, and an active witness." He looked at Daphne, his expression firm but respectful. "This will move fast, and Julian won't like it, but we're not here to play defense anymore. We're taking your life back." For the first time in days, Daphne didn't feel like she was being dragged through someone else's choices. She felt like she had picked up a weapon, not to harm, but to reclaim. She looked down at her son, who was sleeping peacefully in his carrier beside the desk. Then she met Miles's gaze and said clearly, "File it." The next few days moved with sharp purpose. Miles gave them a checklist, and Daphne followed it like gospel. Ownership documents, birth certificate, screenshots of texts, photos of the apartment from before Julian moved in, photos of it now. Nina helped with everything: copying, printing, driving across town to request archived invoices and property tax receipts. Daphne had never felt more exhausted, but never more awake. Each piece of paper was a weapon, and she was finally armed. Julian, for his part, remained silent. Not a single message since she left the apartment. Not even to ask about the baby. Daphne took that silence and folded it into steel. It no longer hurt. It confirmed everything. At the county clerk's office, she stood behind Miles as he submitted the packet. The woman behind the glass skimmed the top page, looked up and said, "This might move quickly. Judges don't like eviction of new mothers." Miles didn't flinch. Nor do I. Afterward, they returned to his office to sign the last few declarations. As Daphne scrawled her name on the final form, she paused. "What if he lies? What if he says I left on my own?" Miles tapped the edge of the table lightly. "Then we show the messages. We show the baby was never once dropped off by him, that you never had access to the home again. And we show video proof that Camilla treated your child as her own, with your belongings, on your property, without permission." Nina added, "And I'll testify. You didn't leave. You were pushed." Daphne nodded slowly. The fear was still there, small, lingering, persistent, but it no longer ruled her. What ruled her now was clarity. She had rights, she had truth, and she had a team. They filed the emergency order that afternoon. By evening, Miles sent a follow-up. It had been received and flagged for urgent review. Daphne sat on the couch in Nina's living room, her son sleeping on her chest, the document stacked beside her like bricks in a wall she was building between her and the man who had torn her life apart. The night was quiet, but inside her something moved, something solid. She was no longer wondering how this had happened. She was preparing for what would come next. Because the next time she saw Julian Sharp, it wouldn't be as his wife. It would be as the woman standing across from him in court. It came on a Tuesday morning. Daphne was changing a diaper when her phone buzzed. The sender was the county court system, a digital notice confirming that the emergency motion had been approved and scheduled. The preliminary hearing was set for the following week. Attached to the email was the formal document: Sharp v. Rowe, case number, judge's name, and the words "Temporary Possession Hearing" stamped in bold. Within the hour, Miles called. "They accepted everything. You'll be notified again when the court delivers formal service to Julian. But it's happening." Daphne nodded, more to herself than to him. "Good." What she didn't expect was how fast the blowback would come. That evening, as she folded laundry in Nina's spare room, her phone lit up with a call from a number she once had memorized. She hesitated, then answered. Julian's voice was sharp, biting. "Are you insane?" Daphne stayed silent. "You filed for an eviction, after walking out and taking my son like I'm some stranger?" "I didn't walk out," she replied. "You told me to call a taxi, after I gave birth. Then you moved her in." There was a beat of silence, then a low, incredulous laugh. "So this is revenge? You think the court is going to hand you everything because you're throwing a tantrum with a baby in your arms?" Daphne's grip on the phone tightened. "This isn't revenge. This is justice." "You're pathetic," Julian snapped. "And you'll regret this. You think this won't follow you, that you can humiliate me in court and walk away?" "I'm not walking," she said coldly. "I'm taking back what's mine." She hung up. The silence afterward was louder than his voice. Nina came in a minute later, holding a tea mug, and saw the look on her friend's face. "Let me guess, he finally cracked." Daphne nodded. "Called me pathetic, threatened me." Nina placed the mug down gently. "That means we're winning." Across the city, Julian stood in his kitchen, pacing. Camilla leaned against the counter, arms folded. "What did she say?" "That she's taking everything." Camilla raised an eyebrow. "Can she?" Julian didn't answer. Because deep down, he knew the truth. And it terrified him. The courtroom was colder than she expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. Marble walls, sharp lighting, polished floors that made each step echo. Daphne sat at the petitioner's table beside Miles, her hands folded tightly in her lap. On the other side, Julian leaned back in his chair, dressed like he was going to a networking event. Charcoal suit, smug smile, every inch of him rehearsed. Camilla wasn't allowed in the courtroom, but Daphne knew she was waiting outside. Always circling. The judge was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pinned tightly back and glasses perched low on her nose. She read the file silently for almost a minute before glancing up. "Ms. Rowe, you are seeking temporary sole custody, exclusive occupancy of the property, and a no-contact order pertaining to your child. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Daphne said, her voice steady. Julian's lawyer rose immediately. "Your Honor, my client contests all of these claims. There is no evidence of abuse or neglect. Ms. Rowe left the residence voluntarily, abandoning the property and placing undue emotional stress on Mr. Sharp, Miles stood. We have extensive documentation that contradicts that narrative, including text messages instructing Ms. Rowe to leave the hospital without assistance, witness testimony confirming coercion, and video footage of a third party, Mr. Sharp's former partner, holding the minor child without consent, inside a home Ms. Rowe legally owns." The judge raised an eyebrow. "The apartment is under her name?" "Purchased independently before the marriage," Miles confirmed. "All financing handled solely by Ms. Rowe. There are no records indicating shared ownership or financial contribution from Mr. Sharp." Julian shifted in his seat. The judge turned back to Daphne. "You said he told you to call a taxi after giving birth?" "Yes, Your Honor. He left me at the hospital curb while preparing our home for his ex-girlfriend." The judge paused, then looked at Julian. "Is that accurate?" Julian started to speak, but his lawyer quickly stepped in. There may have been a misunderstanding in timing and priorities. My client was under stress. I'm not interested in emotional justifications, the judge said crisply. What I see here is a documented pattern of neglect, manipulation, and displacement toward both a new mother and an infant. She flipped through a few more pages, then set the file down. Effective immediately, Ms. Rowe is granted temporary sole custody and exclusive right to occupy the residence until final hearing. Mr. Sharp is to vacate within 10 calendar days. Any contact regarding the minor child will be arranged through legal counsel. Julian's jaw clenched. This is ridiculous. The judge didn't blink. It's the law. The gavel hit the bench. The room went quiet. Outside the courtroom, Daphne stepped into the afternoon sun, holding her son against her chest. Her legs were shaking, but her spine stood straight. She had walked in as a defendant in someone else's story. Now she was writing her own. The door clicked open with the same sound it always had. But this time, it didn't sting. It felt like a page turning. The apartment was empty. Julian and Camilla had moved out 2 days before the deadline, leaving behind only traces: an orchid shriveled on the windowsill, a chipped coffee mug in the sink, and silence that hung in the air like dust. Daphne stepped inside with her son asleep in his carrier, her keys in one hand and a folded court order in the other. She didn't speak. She just looked. The nursery was the first place she entered. The bed with the canopy was gone. Camilla's perfume had faded, but the wallpaper she had installed, beige and lifeless, still clung to the walls like a memory that refused to leave. Daphne stood in the center of the room, took a slow breath, and whispered, "Not anymore." That afternoon, she opened every window, stripped every curtain, and packed every item she hadn't chosen herself. Nina arrived with paint samples and a stepladder. Within hours, the space began to change, color returning where dullness had lived. A soft blue replaced beige. The crib was reassembled. A mobile hung above it, spinning gently with paper stars. There were shelves now, lined with tiny books and stuffed animals. A plush rug, a rocking chair, and sunlight that fell differently, as if even the apartment knew something had shifted. The living room came next. She sold the couch Julian insisted on keeping and bought a new one, smaller, softer, hers. Framed art from her early freelance days went back up on the walls. The kitchen got new light bulbs and a set of bright dishes. She found herself humming while unpacking. Not because everything was okay, but because for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid. At night, after the baby was fed and asleep, Daphne sat by the window, a mug of chamomile in hand, staring out at the city. It looked different now. Not smaller, but more hers. The traffic didn't sound so threatening. The dark didn't feel so heavy. She thought of Miles, of Nina, of the judge's voice saying, "It's the law," and of how far she'd come in such a short time. She still had healing to do. But healing no longer felt impossible. It felt like work. Honest, exhausting, liberating work. As she turned off the lamp and headed to bed, she looked once more at her son sleeping peacefully in the crib she'd built with her own hands. They had taken so much from her. But she had taken it back. A year passed. The apartment was no longer just a place to live. It was a sanctuary. The walls no longer held echoes of arguments or the quiet suffocation of being unseen. They now bore laughter, the babble of a growing toddler, and the soft scratch of Daphne's pencils against sketch paper in the early hours of the morning. Her career, once paused and forgotten in the shadow of someone else's dreams, had found new momentum. What began as simple sketches to process pain turned into a series, raw, vulnerable, unapologetically real. Each drawing told a fragment of her story. The hospital curb, the woman in the robe, the nursery reclaimed, the court hearing, the quiet strength of late-night survival. She titled the collection, Resilience in Silence. It gained traction online. Then came an invitation, a joint residency in Barcelona for emerging female illustrators who had turned trauma into art. It came with funding, childcare support, and the chance to present her work at a gallery that faced the Mediterranean Sea. At first, she hesitated. Leave her home? Her son? The safety she had rebuilt? But Nina sat across from her, arms crossed and eyes fierce. It's 3 months. I'll watch him. My mom will help too. You don't turn down something like this, Daph. You earned it. You bled for it. Daphne looked at her son, walking now, all wide eyes and soft curls. She imagined him growing up seeing her play small, staying quiet, letting the past define their future. Number. That wasn't the legacy she wanted to leave. So she packed a small suitcase, printed her portfolio, and before boarding the plane, she knelt down, cupped her son's face gently, and whispered, "I'll be back soon. Mommy's just going to show the world what we survived." The flight took off in a haze of golden light. As the clouds swallowed San Francisco, she looked out the window, not with regret, but with clarity. Julian had once made her feel disposable. Now, every piece of her life was deliberate. The woman walking into the gallery 3 weeks later, portfolio in hand and spine straight, was not the same woman who had stood freezing outside a maternity ward, abandoned. That version of Daphne Rowe had died in the cold. This one was just getting started.